Okay, welcome to the slightly earlier version of the revenue workshop today under the long-term plan. So yeah, noting the early time of 1 o'clock. Apologies, we have apologies from Councillor Pottinger, Councillor Bond and the Mayor. Do we have any other apologies from the floor?
Councillor Stewart.
Oh, sorry, yes, Councillor Stewart was called away as well. Okay, righto. We don't need to move those, do we? No. Okay, so purpose of the workshop, Rhiannon's going to take us through this.
So purpose of this workshop is really to look at those sources of non-rates revenue that Council's got some opportunity to consider making changes or adjustments to our approach on. So we've already been working on fees and charges for the last few years through the annual plan, and we'll continue to do that, but Patricia's going to draw attention to some areas of focus there. Development contributions, something for Council to consider, and then finally a conversation around what other commercial and collaboration opportunities Council could consider, and getting some strategic direction from you about where you would like to focus. So this workshop will really input into both the financial strategy and the revenue and finance policy, and you have a copy of that policy on your desk, as well as into activity planning.
Okay, so Patricia's going to take us through this. Thank you.
So I thought I'd just do a bit of a breakdown of where our sources of revenue are. So in the 2021-22 annual report is this slightly smaller donut. The bigger one's what's sitting currently in the draft annual plan for 23-24. Traditionally, Invercargill's been around that 50-50, 50% rates, 50% non-rates revenue. What we've seen in the from the last LTP right through, that we're getting closer to being 60-40. Well, we've got a legislative requirement that we can't have more than 60% of our revenue being rates.
Right.
So we've got that there, but it's showing the change. We're getting grants and subsidies, and grants revenue is a moving feast. Traditionally would have been seen to be the Wakakatahi subsidy for roading, but given the capital investment that we're doing at the moment, that's where all the Three Waters additional funding's been coming through. Shovel Ready's been coming through there, as will our third party funding for 12-25. So that will swing it, but we need to be trying to come up with a consistent sources of revenue outside of rates. Dividends come in there. We won't be seeing subvention revenue any further because inland revenue has changed the tax legislation as it applies to us, and we can no longer create tax losses for which we're selling to the group.
Can I just ask then, Patricia, we were receiving subvention payments directly from EIL. Does that include that, or do we look upon that as a dividend payment? It's their subvention.
No, they were buying our tax losses, so
Right.
That's why we were receiving the revenue. So we had tax losses which we sold, so that's where it got through. So really, we're trying to look at where, we either increase our fees and charges. It's where the rental properties come through with their rents. Fines is so small it's probably not even worth including. And then you've got interest, which we're at the mercy of the markets on. So those are our main sources of revenue currently. There's nothing, and that's where part of this is to explore how we might move that, and there'll be some further discussions later on when Steve will look at other options that we've got. If you want to move the slide, Rhiannon. The revenue and financing policy is one of the policies which we'll have to review as part of the long-term plan preparation, but this is the one that sort of directs and actually outlines in that policy for each of our activities how they'll be funded. And those councillors that have been around the table before, remember, it's often, is it to be fully rates funded? Is it to be fully for user pays? Or is it to be a mixture of the two? And this is where that direction, and as we go through fees and charges, there's a couple of areas where perhaps we may need to change that as we go through the LTP process to get that balance right. The policy also, as it says up there, will seeks out all the sources of revenue, as well as where we think how we're distributing the benefit from our services or the benefit from payments. If you go to the next one again, Rhiannon. So this is what we had for the last LTP. Probably not the easiest to read up there, but it showed how we were funding our different activities.
So it is within the policy which you've got on the table in front of you if you want to refer to it.
It's probably actually easy to read in there actually. There's no page numbers. So something like roading, because it's at the top of the list. There's very few user fees coming through there, which would be the parking activity. We get some subsidies from our petrol tax, but the majority of it's funded by general rates as into who best uses that. And then something like water supply is saying the majority of it's funded by a targeted rate, because only those that use that activity, the decision's been made that only those that use that activity should pay for that activity. Though there is a recognition that there's some user fees, but also that there may be some additional revenue sitting in there. So this is the discussion as we come through, and the staff are busy preparing activity plans and asset management plans to go, is there any change of funding, and where they will necessarily be looking for direction for changes in that, and should we be putting a greater reliance on what should be user pays versus less to what would be rates funded, whether it be general or targeted. Is there any questions about that?
Yep, I've got a couple. So what the assumption is that what level of central government funding comes through this?
So the subsidy column and petrol tax is sort of your central government funding. So roading at the same time as we're doing our long-term plan, we're also in discussions with Waka Kotahi on the level of funding that they may have.
Yeah.
And it will come together hopefully towards the end at the same time.
Yeah, so then looking forward on the LTP, if you look at, say, housing, the sentiment seems to be there's more appetite for central government to become involved in partnership with local government and even private sector around supplying that. So how will this change going, through the LTP? Is what I'm trying to sort of get a sense on. Not that perhaps an answer, but I think it's important for us to understand where this could go to in terms of what could move and change in this thing. And
within this LTP, or the first 3 years of this LTP, we may have to address some issues. Water would be a classic. That we're going to have to address that one, and housing may well be, depending on where we sit by the time we come to adopt an LTP, about where we sit. The policy will get adopted at the same time as before we adopt the LTP, isn't it, Rhiannon?
Yeah, so we intend to have the policies with you before Christmas to be confirmed, but there still may be some changes ahead of being adopted for consultation late February.
Okay.
So
I'm getting ahead of myself.
Okay.
Come back to it.
Thank you.
But housing is a good one and that's probably one that many people may not realise, is that for us, our housing care activity is fully user pays. So there is no take from the general rates for that activity.
And can I just add that we have consulted on that before, and that has been the indication from the community that they're very happy for council to continue it, but the percentage was in favour of it not being a draw on rates.
But equally, there's a growing demand for it, isn't there? As we
Yes,
identified
there's
through
no
other
doubt about
workshops.
that.
So, yeah,
But there's work on our existing stock that needs to be done.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
And another consultation may see a different result on the
Yeah.
feeling of the community about the possibility of some rates contribution.
yeah.
Yep.
And so, is there a, how well informed is our community to make that decision around where that should be funded in terms of understanding the need, demand, and sort of the alternative if we don't fund it type thing? It's probably an important piece of information to get to them before they make a decision, isn't it?
Yeah. That consultation was done enough years ago
Yes.
for it to be
Refused.
new information that goes out. Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it could be easily updated, because the one thing we never took into account was the need to upgrade the facilities. And whilst we were treating water with the charges at a subsidised market rate, it didn't allow perhaps for some general rates contribution to
Maintenance.
cover the interest in upgrading the stock.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
It was never an option.
Yeah.
Brandon, can you move it forward? Slide or anything? So probably one of the biggest areas we've got of revenue is our fees and charges. And the italics on the right hand side as you look at it of that is straight from the revenue and financing policy. So if I take it simply, basically fees and charges are basically saying those that use the service pay for the service, and to cover those costs, where the more that people use it, the more it costs. So it's only fair that someone who's a high user pays for that service, and typically often used for services that may be provided to those that don't pay rates or don't live within the city.
Yeah, it's that regional centre concept, isn't it? Darren?
Even then, there are some of those things that we charge for now that I think are overdue for review. Liquor licensing charges, for example, haven't been reviewed since we peeled them back after people were abhorred at a 180% increase. Actually, when you boiled it down to a dollar value, was not much, but the industry hadn't been allowed to adjust for over 20 years. Development contributions was one of those things that was up in one of the earlier slides, and it's been more than a decade since we last canvassed people about that as well. And even animal control charges, at the moment there's I think a slight contribution from the general rate, but it could be reviewed because the rest of the funding goes on dog owners, which is unfair because not all animal control activity relates to dogs. So those are things that are probably due for review in the next realm.
And those are the sort of levers that we've got. So you've picked the obvious ones. There are, there are some that are set by legislation. And the one that comes to mind all the time is the inspections of amusement devices, which is Ferris wheels and the likes, which actually the statutory fee for that, or charge for that service, doesn't cover the after as call out fee. But that's what the legislation says we can charge. So we have been vocal about that in the past, but there is other areas where there is the potential for review and more focus on full cost recovery if that was desired.
Just a bit of a, well, I don't know whether it's left forward or not, but do we have a policy statement / vision around, provision of service? So, how wide and far do we go around the services we provide? Obviously some were legislated to provide, but others, and be interesting to get community feedback, because often it would be otherwise, that the community expects everything but doesn't want to pay for anything. As the, and that's not being disrespectful to community. That's just we all want more for less, don't we? Do we have any sort of?
So that will come through with each of the activities plans for the LTP. So this is what they will deliver,
Right.
What they could deliver.
And there's community input into those.
Part of the consultation as well.
Yeah, so the workshops that will be held in July, you'll get information on all of the activity planning and the asset planning, and the managers will raise to you issues that they believe where either an increase or decrease in the level of service is worth considering. Some of the earlier workshops we've had in the process have been highlighting issues and getting direction from you councillors, which has informed and will inform those workshops in July. So whether we consult on a particular issue will be dependent on the scale of it and whether it meets requirements to consult on the significance and engagement policy. So some smaller changes that would not be a great impact on the level of service you wouldn't consult, and others we definitely would, and that's what we'll do next March.
Okay. Thanks.
Do you want to move it forward? Fees and charges is probably there's 3 areas or 2 areas where I think there is the biggest opportunity for us to consider changes. First is regulatory. So, Jonathan, do you want to jump in here, because this is predominantly all yours, where currently we've probably got some settings that need to be reviewed?
So through you, Chair. So looking at the regulatory side of things, we can see some scope for some adjustment. We believe that the service we're providing now meets the expectations of the community. I think it has to be acknowledged that previously there were some areas where perhaps that wasn't the case. We're satisfied it meets the needs of the community, but there are some questions around do we have the ability to deliver it at a lesser rate? That will come through in the activity management plans. It's arguable that some of the systems we use, we could be using a Rolls-Royce system when a Mazda system would work better. For a simple analogy, some of the other areas we're looking at, in general, the concept would be that the user does pay, and that seems fair and equitable. There are some areas where the user may be paying. They're using our service under duress, and most of those are in compliance type activities where we're duty bound to follow up complaints and resolve them. Yes, we do have the ability to infringe and fine people, but sometimes that leads to not particularly positive outcomes. A good example is probably one of the more recent cases we've had in the Environment Court, where we've been forced to prosecute a property owner for hoarding a lot of stuff on their site that wasn't in accordance with the district plan. It was the right thing to do to prosecute and enforce the district plan. However, it was accepted by the judge that the individual didn't have the ability to pay any fines, so it's gone to community service. That's the cost of that action still has to be funded through council. So these are some of the things that we have to consider. Likewise with abandoned vehicles, where we have an abandoned vehicle that's been burnt out, the community expectation is that that's removed as quickly as possible and resolved. Locating the owner of that vehicle is going to be nigh on impossible. They take steps to ensure we can't locate them while the vehicle's been stolen. However, it's still got to be funded. So it's not, I think with regulatory, it's not as simple as saying user pays. Ideally, user pays, but there are some areas that we just have to anticipate that the community has to put in some, have some skin in the game as well. I think that probably covers it. But yeah, just want to reinforce the next year really will be for us looking at ways that we can provide the service at a lesser rate, and that will involve looking at some of our systems. So we're perfectly happy to have that conversation and see what we can do to improve outcomes.
Okay, thank you.
Rhiannon, the other one we wanted to raise here was probably the fees and charges for water. So, as councillors will recall, at the moment our fees and charges are out for consultation for the annual plan. Oh, it's finished consultation. They're about to come back, where we increased the water rates to reflect how much it was costing to to deliver that service, to deliver that for metered water. But as we go into the LTP, we need to be mindful about the impact of affordable water reforms and what that could do to what our ratepayers will be paying for that service going forward. So it's just we've raised it, it's an issue because I know initially staff had thought that the cost of water from meters could be significantly more, because we have highlighted that it would be a greater cost under affordable water for Invercargill City. But
so when you talk affordable water reforms, that's
three waters using its new name.
Yeah.
So, just to
Yeah, go.
Chair,
Yep.
just in relation to that, so if we're looking at proposing an increase on water, and with 3 waters ahead of us, wouldn't that actually allow a stepping stone into that other price? Because it's like anything, if you have increments into something, it doesn't seem so much, because you've actually had to accommodate or manage that in some way or form. But if you have a low to a high, it can be quite significant. I'll just saying that.
Yeah, and that was part of some of the thoughts of making sure that we are reflecting the cost of delivery.
Yeah.
Yes.
When we did that consultation, that's come back. Yeah.
When we did that proposed increase that's just finished the consultation, we didn't choose the highest possible level by any means. We chose a more reasonable increase than could have been suggested, considering the details we had about the cost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From memory, I think it was 70, 90 and 110, and we went with 90, I think, didn't we? Something like that.
I can't remember what we've got.
We certainly didn't go for the highest charge.
No, we went for the middle. I think
Yeah, we did.
The highest was about 130.
Yeah.
We didn't go there.
Okay. Yeah.
Jonathan?
Through you, Chair. So development contributions. There's 2 parts to this. Essentially, they need a lot of prior planning and preparation, and they also need certainty of where your growth areas are going to be. Feedback from other councils that have implemented development contributions indicated that it has been successful where they've been in the planning stage up to 2 years before the long-term plan side of things. You can get a fair amount of pushback from developers, as is to be expected, but you need to have certainty that you're going to have a large growth in areas and know that that's going to go through, because otherwise you can end up with development contribution notices in place and then there's no growth there, so they largely become ineffective. There's also the issue of central government direction in regard to trying to bring the urban centres in and up as opposed to out and about. With brownfield development, councils have run into issues where proposing to upgrade systems to enable brownfield development provides a disproportionate amount of betterment to properties that are already connected there but aren't necessarily going to be paying an additional charge, whilst properties that develop connected to those services will. So it's something that has to be thought through carefully. It has to be planned, and we would need to be really certain of where our growth areas were going to be and that they were going to be high enough growth to justify development contributions.
Yeah, Darren.
So I think the other aspect of development contributions, because there was very firm pushback from developers who claimed that $2,000 or $3,000 of DCs was actually going to tip their proposals over, which was nonsense. But they can also be used as a tool to encourage development in specific areas. So, for example, if there are parts of the city where infrastructure is nearing capacity or is going to need to be expanded, you could have a higher level of development contribution, but for specific things, because you need to let people know what it is that they're contributing towards. But at the same time, if for example, you were wanting to encourage more brownfield development without us having to extend the services, then there might be a lesser development contribution. But as Jonathan pointed out, there's still that whole, if you're increasing the number of titles on a site, there is actually increased pressure on the system through that. So I guess it's figuring a way of looking at staged development contributions as to where you have them. But it's been over a decade. It's absolutely worth us going back out and raising this with the community again.
So if we introduce a development contributions policy, it would be on a cost recovery, so that any cost that the ratepayers had to bear for that development would be recovered through that development.
I think we have to identify where the development is going to create extra costs. So a development that requires, for example, putting in stormwater and sewage is fine. So they have to put that infrastructure in, but then it's up to the city to maintain it. Whereas a portion of the DC could perhaps be allocated towards the maintenance. I think we looked at development contributions going towards parks and reserves. Well, obviously, if we're looking at reducing the number of parks and reserves, that's not something specific, but it's figuring out what it is that they can be contributing towards that's going to be the key.
Leslie, were you?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just remember when I first came on council, I seem to remember there was a working party looking at development contributions at that time, and the conclusion was that the administrative overheads made it at that stage an unattractive proposition, and it may be time that we address that, but I think that admin overheads issue is one that you have to bear in mind.
That would be part of a paper, wouldn't it? If we're going to do this, what's our cost to recover?
Yeah, I mean, at the time when we first consulted, it was, we didn't go with it because we wanted to see something happening, and we saw development contributions as perhaps being a discouragement towards that. But I mean, Councillor Slapper's right. There are costs associated with it as well.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Okay. You want to move it forward, Ren? So the next one we wanted to discuss with you was generating revenue through community services, and I asked Steve to.
Yeah, thanks through you, Mr. Chair. Look, one of the things that the team are working on continually is efficiency and effectiveness in the services we deliver. But there are other ways in which we can be more efficient, especially with the funding. And what I guess the revenue and financing policy does not limit our ability to do this, but I think previous discussions around the table, around previous initiatives around cafes and around a little bit more commercial activity in our space, has lent towards council not wanting to enter into competition with the commercial sector or with our business sector. Just wanting to put that out there as to whether or not you actually want us to bring concepts forward. And there are probably three areas that we can identify, and it's not unintentional that we've been reporting cafe performance at Splash Palace for some time, because what it does show, with a very clear focus and a business strategy, we can actually turn essentially what was a community service and good that lost us money every year into a service that's more valued by the community, but also generating revenue surplus that goes back into the pool's operations to help offset that rates take. That's taken a little bit of work, but it's been done all largely by in-house staff with a clear focus and a bit of a mandate. We could take that approach. Similar areas such as the venues, such as the library, where we look to create that community hub but not shy away from opportunities that actually can generate a commercial return, whether that's through lease space to a partner business, or whether or not that's utilising existing infrastructure and staff and expanding that scope of service. So that's one option. The second option is around sponsorships and naming rights. Now, again, probably more relevant in Splash Palace, but equally relevant to Rugby Park if and when council becomes an owner of that asset. That the naming and sponsorship opportunity is there, and whether or not we want to target and actively go there, again, not restricted from the revenue and financing policy, but a clearer direction would be quite beneficial. The final one is around product development and promotion. So that is actually we become a bit more active in that commercial promotion and product development place, and that would be to a degree in our venues at Civic Theatre. We actually go and start bidding for events and start developing events that have a commercial return through the ticket sales. Now that would take a lot longer to do, but again, another opportunity where taking a slightly different approach to what a community service is, but not also shying away from the opportunity to produce an offset to a rates take or a user fee.
Yeah. Okay. Darren?
Yes to all three. So for the cafe and retail services I think are slightly different in that if you've got a shop associated with a venue with souvenirs, that's quite appropriate. But there's always been some pushback about us competing with the private sector around cafes. It's worth remembering that it's not untested territory because the cafe at the museum was previously leased out and only stopped actually when the existing leaseholder had kind of overcapitalised. So we're lucky at the moment with Splash Palace that we've got some staff who really managed to turn that around very well. But that could just as easily tip off, and what's a constantly changing sphere. So I'm more in favour of us leasing those spaces, sponsorships and naming rights. You know, it's a day after. One time it was called Ericsson Stadium, but yesterday Mount Smart was given to Go Media. Rugby Park was previously Homestead, which the ILT paid for. And then they gifted back the name of Rugby Park, but actually it's worth us intimely examining that again because we don't want to see it as just a rugby venue. There is a limit though. I mean, I wouldn't go and sell off the Civic Theatre, which I think with a cultural thing is potentially more fraught. But at the Civic, they have recently moved into developing their own products, mostly for activation of space, which is really commendable. It is potentially fraught when you get into speccing on events, particularly in this, I want to say post-COVID, but it's not really, in the new now. But it's worth a shot for coming up with the right event to activate a space like the Civic Theatre or Rugby Park that gets people into them that wouldn't normally be there. It might not necessarily be making dollars for us, but it is certainly giving people a better sense of value for money. But all three of those suggestions I think we should actively look at.
Okay, cool. Welcome, Alan. Do you have any view on that around?
No, I'm pretty much agreeable with Darren there. I certainly believe that if you're going to have cafes and retail spaces, the best option is really to lease that out to private enterprise and just get the regular lease money in rather than try and do business.
Yeah.
Because business people will always do business
better
if it's their own business, better than somebody who actually
that's right.
has an employed position to do.
Yeah.
Sponsorship and naming, totally agree. I mean, Rugby Park, I mean, at the end of the day, it should be renamed. I mean, you might get $1 million for it. You might get $500,000 for it. And of course, that goes a long way towards the revamping of it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And product development and promotion, I'm not too sure what you can do with that, really, to be fair. I mean, I don't want to buy a T-shirt with ICC on it. Invercargill.
Steve, did you have a
Well, maybe you do.
Yeah.
Let's go.
And let's go Invercargill. Thank you. Look, and just to put the other spin on it, and I've been involved in a number of operations both here and in Christchurch where we've driven something ourselves, because the challenges, which is around that service element, is if the council does it, we've basically got all the overheads and everything contained, and we should be operating on a mandate of when the doors open, the service starts. The difference between that approach, because that's the approach we've taken at Splash Palace, we're starting to sell coffees at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we don't stop selling food until about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. We can then extend the operating hours and provide that service. Now, the challenge is when you provide that to the commercial market, their overheads and their cost model and their cost barriers determine sometimes the opening hours of those services aren't always aligned to our facilities. And so that the flip side of that is we get a steady source of income, which I completely agree with Alan on that point. But we don't maximise the income, because maximising means you're selling as soon as you open and you stop selling as pretty much when you shut. That's the difference between us being really focused on revenue in our community services versus being more of a passive land facility manager. And the difference in product development too is at the moment we're doing product development for activation. We're not doing it for revenue. We talk about different risk and a different skill set in that space. So that's just to give you the context, and it's not to say if you go the leasing space, that's fine, because it actually is a little bit easier. But we also miss a little bit too, because we're making a lot more money now at Splash Palace than we would do through a commercial lease. And so that's the benefit of offsetting rates that you may trade off.
Yeah, and I think another piece there, I'll come to you in a minute, Alan. There's that complimentary service, isn't there, that someone can go to the pool at 6 o'clock and get a coffee, which, commercially probably, but because you've got those services connected to another service, and the museum would be another example, and the library probably could be another example, and it's a bit of a tweak and difference to us, but we've got to really understand the benefit, because there is a cost to serve. So Alan?
I was going to say something similar, actually. I mean, you might find that you do sell the odd coffee at 6 o'clock, but if it's commercially viable, a commercial person would be doing that anyway.
That's right.
Otherwise, it's going to be costing you money and actually costing you revenue, okay? Because you might have somebody pay on the ticket, selling the tickets, but then you still have to have somebody to look after the coffee. And if you're doing 3 or 4 coffees an hour, believe me, you're not making any money whatsoever, and it's costing you money.
Yeah.
So that's commercial reality.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. I was going to say, if we're exploring that particular one any further, I'm just thinking the example of our Queen's Park cafe operation may be one that is worth doing a little bit of a case study on.
It's leased, isn't it?
Could we lease that out?
That's what
It
I'm
is
saying.
leased.
It's a,
Yeah, it
it's
is,
a
yeah.
lease.
Yeah, it is,
It's
yeah.
a leased property,
Mm.
and it has been, it's been running as a long
Yes, it
lease
is.
property
Yeah, it
for
is.
a very long time,
Mm.
which would be an interesting case study to look at, along with a case study of the Splash Palace operation as our own operation.
And just to that end, because that would be useful information going forward with the museum, wouldn't it? To have a good understanding around
That's
what our
exactly
best
what I'm
option is.
thinking,
Yeah.
yes.
Darren?
So one thing I forgot to mention, Chair, was under sponsorships and naming rights. I think something we need to be wary of is that what we're interested in is cash. Because there are a lot of sponsorship deals for events and venues, and I'm not using Go Media at the stadium in Auckland as an example, but you will get media organisations, and yes, this comes from my jaundiced experience of working within them, who offer reciprocal trade agreements, contra.
Yeah.
And that's worth nothing to us. They'll tell us, it's $50,000 worth of advertising, which is rubbish because that's at full rate, which they never charge. But if a media organisation is coming forward with money, as a car dealer would be, that's fine.
Yeah. The other money. Yeah, it's all about the money. Show me the money.
Yep.
The other thing I think is if you're gonna go down a growth opportunity in a business, or even in this council, you always play to your strengths. So how well do we understand our strengths? And I know for a fact that the Southern District Council get a Dunedin company come in to mow their lawns, yet we have a lawn mowing, a groundkeeping facility. Can we leverage that up and do it across a wider network as an example? Like, is that a strength of ours that we could leverage? I'm only using the example. I'm not saying we should explore that, right? But coming back to the principle of you always play to your strengths. What are our core strengths? And that's the areas, if we find any, we should try to grow. And then I think the other piece is just around the, if there's a complementary service that we can offer, we've probably got to do that. It might not be as commercially viable as a normal commercial operation would see it, but it works for us in other ways.
I think that also works within, and I won't use lawn mowing because I know we're short staffed there, but and other services that council provides in our regulatory arm, we provide support to other councils.
Yeah.
Are we charging enough for it? Because if we're just covering our costs, it's
That's
not worth it. We're just loading up more work on our staff. If we're making good money out of it and saving somebody else the problem of having those overheads, that's worth it to them. And I think if it's keeping a full workload on our staff, and they know that it comes with a real value to council as well, that is another way of managing what we have and on selling. Yeah,
and the other thing, if you look at the park service, for example, there could be opportunity that comes out of us growing there through, we get to grow our own more because we've got more opportunities to grow apprentices and through that thing. So we just, by being bigger, you get more advantages, in this example. So, Pani?
Just to sort of add a wee tab to the product development type stuff, and given that we've got sales at Splash Palace and at Queen's Park and things like that, I mean, with the new vibe CBD here, product development as in promotion type materials, I mean, would sell quite well through some of those premises because everyone wants to have something from Invercargill if they're visiting. So if you're talking like promotion type of materials or those sort of types of things, and other people wanting to jump on that bandwagon, I mean, we could probably charge them in some way or form.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a thought.
Yeah. Right.
If you develop the right product.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we sort of started down that path with that Invercargill CBD branding that we came up with the big eye, which everybody caught on to.
Yeah, which is cool. Yeah.
It's interesting that the Southland rugby jersey is one of the most common rugby jerseys that you can see in a crowd at international games.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest sellers in NPC rugby.
Behind the All Blacks.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you come up with the right product.
Yes, I'm sorry.
We've talked about what we could do in the CBD, and some of those apps that you can get that could tell the story of how it's developed. The way that morning that we had,
Yes.
That would be a product we could sell into the hotels or have available even to hire.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd have to be costed so that it was.
Yeah, or
we
sell
made
the advertising on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good example.
That would be fantastic.
Is that your wheelhouse, Steve?
IT.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No.
It's a very forced yes.
It's part of the products. When we're talking about products, we're talking very widely about the form of those products. We're not just talking about a T-shirt or a mug or whatever.
No.
We're talking about potential for use of intellectual property and IT and so it probably is, Steve.
Yes. The reason why it's a strained yes is what we'd actually need the policy to say and have that commitment around this table is that actually is something you want us to go and start investigating. Because if we do all the work and we bring it back and then you go, don't compete with local business because local business could do it better, then I think we should, that's probably the benefit of having the conversation now, to get that clarity to go, do you want us to? Because if we do, we will. But then don't be surprised when we bring back the answer that says we can do it better.
Yeah.
Or we can't.
Yeah.
And so that's probably where the policy needs to be helpful for us to say we want to go into this direction, and we recognise we are going to enter into a space we haven't been in actively before, but we're prepared to for these reasons, or work in partnership with others to develop these things, because they are two different approaches. We can do both.
Yeah.
What we need is the policy to direct us as to which one you would like us to achieve, or how you would like us to achieve it.
Yeah, and just Alex has just made a comment on the chat to that example, partnering with local businesses like Digital Stock to be able to bring something to the market. So
Or youth.
Yeah.
Can I just make the point, Steve? It's not that we haven't been in it before. I'm just thinking about the former museum shop where we were selling some obviously branded Invercargill products that were made in some cases by other Invercargill firms and so forth. So I'm just thinking to some extent we have been in it before, and it may be a very good further exploration considering that 1225 is not that far away, and we want to think about the cafe and retail aspect of what is in our new museum.
And that would also, sorry, through you,
Yeah.
that would also counter what you were saying about competing with other businesses. Like if we got businesses to develop it and then sold it in the museum or somewhere, it gives other people an opportunity perhaps.
I just wanted to share because the Pounamu that was being sold out of the museum was locally carved.
That's right. Yeah.
And I used to send everyone there. If they wanted a real piece of genuine Pounamu, I would send them to the museum.
Yes, and there were locally blown glass works and so forth that were.
And is it also something we could chuck to, the young entrepreneurs thing that the schools run and link them in to say, come up with some ideas and maybe chuck out some thoughts like a digital app or the museum. What ideas have our young people in the city got about how we could make more money out of the museum? It could be something to throw at them and put it through that young entrepreneurs thing and see what they come back with.
Through you, Chair. Look, I think that's the balancing act of what's directly driven and taken on by council versus or do we just act as a passive landowner and seek partners to come and do that job? And in a way, they both deliver a revenue and an income stream, but one is a lot more close to our operation, the other is a lot closer to the commercial and the business sector's operation and way of doing things. And there might be mixes, but it's to what degree do you want council and staff in particular to really investigate a delivery option there versus a partnership option. So it's actually, we'll always partner with local business when it makes sense to, but it's whether or not we're driving that or whether or not we lease that out and just hope someone else does that. That's probably the kind of the key nut of that problem.
And so that's why, if I step back, I think rather than policy, we come up with guiding statements like, grow our strengths, because that's directional. And what you'll find, what we'll find probably is that for some it'll, some opportunities it'll be a direct link and others will partner. And, whereas we get too specific and say, well, it's only got to look like this, we probably could miss opportunities, but equally chase down some dreams that we're just going to drop, we're going to be poor at. So it's more, what are the guiding principles around where we look to grow revenue and invest? And if we have those guiding principles, they give us that sense check to say, yep, it meets those principles, let's go and get staff to investigate it further and bring back the information, as opposed to us have a policy and staff run around trying to get stuff to meet the policy or find stuff that does meet the policy.
I just want to share that I have to put it in the trash because there is value in the audio type storytelling stuff, because that's what we've been trying to do with the new development here, Stead Street, all of that. There's an opportunity for to invest in something like that and lead that type of stuff. But like the other stuff, I think there is that partnership.
Yeah, and equally with it, iwi mana whenua, isn't it? Like there's a great partnership there between. If
That's
you
what
look
I'm
at that
saying.
storytelling around the CBD with Ngāi Tahu, and it'd be
Yeah,
wonderful.
and you could do not just the CBD, but Steer Street, all the new development
Yeah,
type stuff. But you could actually do that in a partnership.
Okay,
going
cool.
forward.
Righto. Good discussion. Thank you. Righto, next.
Yes. Well, we've sort of got well. Next steps for staff. We're going to take the guidance, and if I've been sort of the notes that I've been taking down and what we've been hearing, is that you're open to us looking for other ways of generating revenue, but we need to be very mindful of partnership, of what are our strengths, and what probably was less clear is whether we can or cannot compete against local, but I think it was work with.
Yeah.
Was what I was hearing. There was no clear in either way.
I think the key through your chair is that we want to generate revenue. It's not we want to develop products so much as we want to develop products with a view to generating more revenue.
Yeah.
Combination.
Yeah, but for this point, the focus is the.
Yeah. So, look, I think it'd be good to bring back, some of those principles around, grow our strengths, partner with community. So leverage the community strengths. Look for opportunities to partner with other key stakeholders, be it mana whenua, youth, South Alive. Some of these stakeholders that are, got some good capability, if you like, and that's probably another principle is make sure capability is understood.
So as it stands, I think we're bringing asset and activity plans back in front of you in July and August, Rhiannon?
Yep, so the next workshop after this one will be on the financial strategy and the infrastructure strategy. So we'll start by bringing all of these conversations together, and then you'll get the detailed overview of each activity in July.
And as each activity, staff will have gone through and considered where they think that funding source for that activity should sit, and be seeking feedback from you on that.
Cool. Yeah, that's us. Righto, thank you to those on live stream, and thanks Alex for joining us on live stream, and thank you for the councillors for coming on.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Timing, Tom.
Pardon?
Good timing.
Yeah. Did I miss anything? We
It was
made so
great.
many big decisions.
No, gave out.